Soil specialist, Dieter. Unfortunately, Dieter couldn't be here today, so I'm going to do my best to represent some of his work, which means I'm going to be following a script a little bit closer. All right, so, and I think this is really relevant to the discussions we were having yesterday, and, you know, we've been talking internally in the ministry about the need for kind of a standard soil health protocol, right? So we're all kind of evaluating the same things and speaking the same language. Okay, so some of the objectives that we have around identifying some indicators of soil health and carbon sequestration. So we can, assess soil health and carbon sequestration in response to different management practices. So our ultimate goal, right, is to develop like a resilient food and fiber industry, a production industry, and mitigation of climate change. Looking at so to do that, we want to evaluate the impacts of management practices on soil health and carbon sequestration, and how that's going to affect climate change, right? We want to be selecting we want to identify which are the most effective practices that we could be adopting. So it kind of goes back to my last presentation on, where should we really be focusing our energy to have the best outcomes and target those interventions, and how do we promote adoption? Okay. We also there's the need to develop a baseline so we can really monitor changes that are happening. So Dieter thinks that he proposes that there's 4 components that should be part of the soil health protocol, right? The first one is the set of indicators, right? This is the focus of Dieter's current work and of this presentation. And it also includes, like considering who is physically doing these measurements and collecting the data. Okay. And then there's the modality, what he calls the modalities of data sharing. And so that's what are we doing with that data once it's collected? Where do we compile it? Who manages and holds that data? And how do we utilize as a network of researchers and agrologists say how can we utilize that data? So the third part is having an infrastructure in place. And so that includes, the people on the ground. Do we have enough qualified professionals who are going out there and collecting the data? And do we have the laboratory capacity? So that, there's some talk yesterday about lab capacity, throughput, consistency, that sort of thing. And is there, we've been talking about, could the ministry be working with the labs to adopt, the methods of analysis that we think are most appropriate? And could we maybe develop like a soil health package? So people who are submitting their samples, maybe our research partners or different agrologists could be submitting to the lab and just request that BC soil health package and have everything covered. Okay, and then there's a coordination of research activities and technology development. And I think that's what his intent there is really, how are we all working together to collaborate and coordinate our efforts to measure soil health and monitor changes. Okay, so some criteria that Dieter identified for identifying the best indicators of soil health. They should be accurate and precise. They should be relevant, sensitive, but at the same time sufficiently robust. They should be universally acknowledged, or we don't want to be pulling some things out of the fringe. It should be something that generally the science community agrees upon. They should be, I guess, each indicator we select should be able to tell us a piece of the story. We should limit redundancy in them. Okay. And they should be easy to interpret. and allow us to translate them into management practices. Okay. So Dieter's proposing like a two-tiered approach, where we could have a set of soil health indicators that are more, that could be measured in the field easily. That data collection could be done by laymen or non-scientists. So it doesn't require significant training or costly equipment to do. And maybe that could include some indicators that are part of like regular soil testing or like a fertility analysis. Okay, so things that can be done in the field, and they can be used to ground truth what he's calling the tier 2. So the tier 2 soil indicators would be those that maybe give us greater insight, they're more accurate. But they, some of those do require a specialized skill set, or having access to specialized equipment. And so, that's the type of stuff that's usually done in laboratories. I personally see kind of two applications, like our relevance of these two tiers, where that tier 2 is really, it's that scientific inquiry, helping us to understand what's going on, have some, generate some definitive answers or understanding. And that tier 1 is looking more on that kind of in situ, we could do more extensive testing. But I also see tier 1 as a good opportunity for knowledge and technology transfer, right? It's a learning opportunity. If you can get out there with producers and show them how they can do some of these assessments in the field and tie that back to how their management practices affect those qualities and how those qualities will affect the resiliency of their production system, I see them as a really good learning aid. Okay, so I think several people in this room probably completed a survey for Dieter that he had sent out, trying to identify, if we could come up with come to a consensus on what are the best soil health indicators. He sent that survey out to 40 people, from academia, government, industry, research. We had a 45% completion rate, which isn't bad for a survey, I think. And he had proposed, different physical, chemical, and biological indicators that were based on, some literature study and communication that he's had with soil health experts. And even though of those, he wanted to note that not all the participants, or not all 18 people, answered all of the questions. So, but we got a fairly good indication there. So the survey questions, he was proposing like a different sets of indicators and asking whether those indicators would be suitable as a tier 1 indicator or a tier 2 indicator, or whether or not they were not relevant soil health indicators. And that could be maybe because we have insufficient knowledge or data to support the interpretation of those. The methods are extremely expensive or laborious, or whether or not they're just not a good indicator of soil health. Okay, so the response is tier 1, you can see, I think the list that he has here is maybe everything that he thought had a high enough agreement that we could maybe move them forward for further consideration as an indicator. So anything maybe below 40% was rejected. So this isn't a complete list of everything that was asked. So, at the top there, we see soil structure, pH, EC, bulk density, say like penetration resistance, depth of the A horizon. He noted that's an interesting one. And I think going back to, what was discussed yesterday, just even in terms of your sampling depth and how tillage might affect that sampling depth, we might say the same thing about, how somebody might be measuring the A horizon. If you fluffed it up and gone to do that measurement right afterwards, I wonder sometimes, if we've created that anthropogenic horizon through regular tillage, is that still a good indicator? And also sometimes it can be difficult to differentiate that transition between the A and B horizon. Total organic carbon and soil organic matter were also in there. They're not necessarily things that are as easy to measure in the field, though. What was interesting is odor was one. And odor is, I guess that's quite a subjective indicator. So how could we really kind of compare results in different? So, but maybe there's some qualitative value. Maybe we could develop some sort of a 1 to 5 scale for odor. Okay. And hopefully we get this back, but I'll just jump in and speak to what the tier 2 ones are. So the tier 2 indicators are the highest ones that we had, all above 70% response rate that agreed on them, was potentially mineralizable nitrogen, soil fertility, including micronutrients, cation exchange capacity. And then at the 67% agreement rate was base saturation and particulate organic matter. Lower down was looking at macronutrients, reactive carbon, hot water extractable carbon, hot water extractable nitrogen, sodium absorption ratio, and microbial biomass. So Dieter's thoughts on like the macro and micronutrients is we're already doing that quite often as part of, fertility tests. But he thought, we might need to agree on extraction and analysis methods. And I know like often in BC, it's the Kelowna, but a lot of labs aren't offering the Kelowna method. So if we still agree that that's the best one, maybe we need to, again, work with the labs to offer that service. I know just a plug for our nutrient management resources is we do have a conversion calculator on there, so you can convert your like your Bray to a Kelowna. Okay. Base saturation, that's widely used by commercial labs and some advisors, but the scientific community by and large, agrees that there's maybe limited evidence that base saturation is a good indicator of fertility. In terms of labile carbon, there's many different methods for measuring labile carbon. We need to pick one or two. They all give slightly different results, and perhaps in the future, we can change our position to those indicators, but there's still a lot of discussion. So Dieter's thoughts are maybe we don't put all of our eggs in one basket now. Should we maybe be looking at a couple of them? The Soil Health Institute recommends mineralizable carbon. So extractable carbon and nitrogen are popular with the Haney test. There's also cold water extractable carbon and nitrogen that can give some different results. However, labile carbon is also dependent on soil management and the nature of soil amendments being used. He says there's little research on it, but it hypothesizes that fields that are fertilized with liquid manure and fields that receive mature compost will have totally different results without one being less healthy than the other. And he pitches as that's maybe a research idea for academia. Okay. Comments on microbial biomass. It's a relatively common indicator, but the problem of many biological indicators is that they're difficult to interpret. Total biomass does not differentiate between functional groups and the abundance and diversity of species and whether or not they're pathogenic or beneficial. And they're also dependent on some soil amendments, whether it be manure, compost, and the quality of those amendments and the type of crop that's growing, right? If you're growing a non-mycorrhizal crop, you may see lower mycorrhizal populations in there. Does that necessarily mean that the soil is less healthy? Okay, and then of the indicators that were not recommended due to inconclusive knowledge or limiting data, and we only had a couple votes on each of those, and they were odor, the metabolic quotient, microbial community, weed pressure, proteins, and arginine ammonification. Okay, indicators that were not recommended because assessment methods are extremely laborious or impractical. Saturated hydraulic conductivity, erosion, Again, some of those biological indicators, plant available water. So I know he had, so it's actually not, Dieter doesn't feel that plant available water is that laborious. We just use kind of 5 or 6 points. And he says at the Ministry of Environment lab, it costs less than $40. And plant available water could be quite valuable for producers. Okay. So with respect to identifying those metrics that were not indicators of soil health, none got more than 1 vote. So I think of the set of indicators he shared with everybody, they were all in some way good indicators of an indicator of soil health, though maybe they didn't get rated high, or might have just been how people responded to the survey as well. Didn't complete that portion. So Dieter's personal preferences on what he thinks should be included in a standard set of soil health indicators. And he included there on the columns on the right what the responses of the survey were, so we can see how Dieter's opinion compares with the survey respondents. Up there is total carbon, soil organic matter, active carbon fraction, macronutrients, including pH and EC, aggregate stability, and he has both in field using a portable rainfall simulator and the lab test. Okay. He also included plant available water and bulk density. So total carbon is necessary if we want to get carbon sequestration data, and we need to adopt a universally accepted method. Soil organic matter, he commented that some may say not much incremental value if we have soil carbon, but still the differences between soil organic matter and total carbon may give us some clues on carbon losses. And paired that with the reactive carbon and information on the use of soil amendments, it may be a powerful team. So he'd like to keep the door open for both of those. It says reactive carbon is a placeholder for the active food source. And he feels this is quite, like epoxy or carbon mineralization potential is maybe an easy and available method to use. It has pH is actually a more popular as a tier 1 indicator, but since it's usually included in a soil fertility test, why not doing all the tests? And in fact, including micronutrients every 3 years. So, we should just, we're doing that package anyways. Fertility is always a concern for producers. He also feels plant available water is crucial for growers. And of course, there are other factors that determine available water from the soil, like coarse matter content and depth of horizons to an impermeable layer or the water table. This is why it's important not to use absolute numbers, but rather relative changes in time. So he feels that bulk density is actually not a great indicator in many fields under annual production. But we do need this number to determine carbon sequestration. Okay. And he noted here that the Soil Health Institute, as we heard yesterday, recommended measurements of a minimal suite of 3 measurements, and those include soil organic carbon concentration, carbon mineralization potential, and aggregate stability. So, and I think we discussed yesterday as well about the importance of also collecting some of that management, understanding the conditions under which we're measuring those soils. And that includes management practices like history of tillage, amendments, cropping and cover cropping, and whether or not there's the integration of livestock, and understanding the climate that system is in. And in order to help us interpret and have value for the producers, some of the economics and understanding how some of those indicators might relate to crop response and performance. So I may just quickly touch on this. My next presentation, we'll get into this a little bit deeper. where Dieter was, some of his thoughts on data collection, storage, and analysis, and some things that we may want to consider in terms of like who's doing this field work, where will that data be stored, who's doing the analysis, and without that analysis, our soil health assessment it's kind of pointless. Well, so what are we doing for, right? It's to figure out where we need to make changes, where we can see advances and improvements. And who's responsible for reporting? Who will do it and what sorts of formats? As government, these are questions that we have. I think we just talked in the last discussion we had around challenges around trust and privacy issues. So who holds that data? Who, manages it? Who reports out on it? And who can we share that with? So, Dieter had some thoughts on, how we're collecting our data in the field and how can we have good data sets. He feels there's few methods are truly suitable for crowdsourcing. He doesn't feel that we should necessarily be putting the onus on farmers to be collecting this data. Will they be motivated to do it? Will they follow the procedures that we're asking? Will they do it, as they're busy with running their businesses? Are they going to do it, at the times when we want them to do it? And that maybe we need to be contracting some of these services out. I mentioned earlier, I think there's opportunities to be in the field with producers and doing these things for a learning exercise. But if we're trying to be collecting data here, we may need to contract that out. So even that tier 1 level of things that are easy to do and require a less qualified skill set. I think anybody who's done research knows you want to have the same person doing that evaluation across treatments and replicates to minimize, that evaluator bias. Okay, and through that, hopefully, we can get more consistent quality data. And when you pay people, they tend to be motivated by that paycheck at the end of the month. Okay. So is the infrastructure in place? So again, I think it's, do we have enough qualified professionals out there that if we were to contract, I know we struggle sometimes in government, like we see maybe limited capacity of people to contract out and provide some of these services to. It makes me wonder, like, what role do we play? We provide training for environmental farm planners. We also provide training services to qualify agrologists to do nutrient management planning. Are there other types of education that the ministry should be offering to help build up capacity in the province to do this work? I think there's a role that government can play in working with the labs, obviously with the influence of some of the people in the room, and encouraging some of our labs to adopt, offer the services and adopt the methods that would be part of a soil health package. Okay. And is the future covered? We need to be looking forward to see, like, where's the technology going? What's evolving in terms of how we measure these things? We've talked in some ways about how stuff can be, measured by satellites. Is it always going to be boots on the ground? Or are there going to be robots that are out there? Will there be an attachment on a tractor that's, measuring soil indicators as a farmer goes to the field in the future? And how do we make sure that the work that we're doing is encouraging the evolution of that technology and helping with the adoption and the interpretation of the data that we're getting through that? Okay, I'm actually going to end there because the next presentation will get into that last slide. So